The Saartjie Baartman Centre is open over the festive season for GBVF victims. Women's shelters are struggling to stay open, particularly during the festive period, as they juggle low funding and an influx of victims. According to recent crime stats released by Minister Min Bheki Cele, from July to September of 2022, 989 women were murdered. Over 13,000 victims were victims of assault, and 1,277 victims were victims of attempted murder. Of course, with cases likely to increase, we're going to speak to Saartjie Baartman Centre for Women and Children Director Advocate Bernadine Bachar for more. Advocate Bernadine, thank you for joining us here on the SABC and welcome.
Good afternoon, Liesl. Thank you for having me, and festive greetings to you and to your viewers.
I want us to question whether it is festive, given, these alarming stats that I've just highlighted, and perhaps, the reality that a lot of women and children, the vulnerable, are going to be experiencing during this time. And so given the surge, how worrying is it that, women's shelters at this point are struggling to stay open?
It's exceedingly concerning, Liesl. If you have a look at the latest research that came out from Lancet Psychiatry, that said that between 30 and 50% of women in South Africa over the age of 15 will experience intimate partner violence, which is either physical violence and or sexual in nature. Now, our population, our women in South Africa is 30 million. So we're really looking at between 10 and 15 million women being subjected to intimate partner violence. Now, the difficulty for us at shelters is that we're just not getting the funding that we need in order to provide services to our survivors.
Absolutely. So with that said, to date, how many shelters are registered under the National Shelter Movement in South Africa, given the number of women predicted to be affected? How many can the shelters ultimately accommodate? For how long? What does that? What do those stats look like during this festive period alone?
So there are 96 shelters that form part of the National Shelter Movement. There are 20 shelters that form part of the Western Cape Women's Shelter Movement. And at this moment in time, 14 of those 20 shelters will be facing closure if we do not receive additional funding over the next couple of months. The situation is untenable and it's dire.
Perhaps you could speak to the woes of the organization. To date, the Saartjie Baartman Centre alone, we know that the Northwest branch is closed down. Western Cape in particular is struggling financially. There's a deficit of over 1 million rand. What is going to happen if you have to shut down?
Well, we're the largest shelter in South Africa. We can cater and accommodate 120 women and children. And we don't only have a shelter, we run 9 different programs that either are responses to gender-based violence or preventative programs. And those range from legal empowerment programs to economic empowerment programs and our child protection program. So at this moment in time, our monthly deficit after Department of Social Development funding is 500,000 Rand a month. So we have to pull in an additional 6 million Rand every month just to keep the doors open. So 6 million Rand every year to keep the doors open.
Looking at what government has done to date, want us to question whether it is enough. We obviously seen the National Strategic Plan on gender-based violence and femicide, amongst other calls to action. But how would you weigh in on that, just given the reality on the ground, our contemporary history, really also marred by the violent history and patriarchy that obviously brought us here to date?
So there has been some very good work done recently, noticeably in our National Strategic Plan, which is a fantastic framework to address and prevent gender-based violence, as well as the so-called 3 GBV laws. The difficulty in South Africa, and this has always been the difficulty, is when it comes down to implementation. And what we're struggling with at the moment, the most, is funding of the programs that actually respond to gender-based violence survivors.
So as we particularly head into the peak of the festive season, what is your call to action? What would you like help with in terms of women and children or the vulnerable who need assistance? How do they go about contacting you and finding out more?
Liesl, they can come to the Saartjie Baartman Centre at any one time. They can literally just walk up to our gates. They can also get hold of us on 021 633 5287. And the National Shelter Movement has a shelter helpline. The number for that is 0800 001 005, and that the helpline serves all women in South Africa that want to get into shelters and or get their protection orders. But really what we're asking for at the end of the day is more funding. And that boils down to, if government is saying that they're unable to fund us fully, well, then they need to bring the private sector into the room. Shelters are actually providing services to survivors that the Department of Social Development is constitutionally mandated to do. So we're doing the work of the Department of Social Development. If they're saying they're unable to fund us fully, then we're saying to them, please bring corporates into the room so that they can give us additional funding so that we can carry on doing the really good work that we're doing for survivors in the community.
Advocate Bernadine Bachar, let's leave that conversation there. Thank you very much for your time. The Saartjie Baartman Centre for Women and Children Director, Advocate Bernadine Bachar, talking about the work that's being done by the centre, noting that the centre, in fact, will remain open over the festive season to assist GBV and F victims. Again, Women's Shelter really struggling at this time as they face an influx of victims and also juggling low funding at this juncture.